And then there's another, I think it's somewhere around $6 billion or so in tax cuts, in terms of the, I think individuals getting about a $400 reduction in their taxes, a couple $800, which will it's going to show up in reduced withholding starting on April 1st.
Okay.
But every state is struggling, with a very serious economic situation, maybe possibly the worst since the 1930s. And without this stimulus package, we think that our unemployment rate would go much higher than it is now. This is not going to solve the problem, but we think it's going to help. It's going to probably prevent a lot of states from having to lay off thousands of employees and cut support to education, healthcare, and so forth. So we think it's very important, and we think we have a good system in place to make sure that we spend the money wisely, and that we account for every dollar. That's very important.
Well, and that really kind of comes into the appropriations process. You and I see each other a little bit in that process. Maybe that's not your day job, if you will, but there is a little bit happening in appropriations. For those that are listening, is basically the state spends the money that we take in, everything that we're talking about. And so there has to be a law for every department, basically, that says, here's what you're allowed to spend, and here's kind of the your piece of legislation, your right to spend the money, if you will. And then on the appropriations process, we spend many months going through what are we going to spend and how are we going to spend it. How does Treasury play into that process?
Well, just one thing in terms of the stimulus, of course, that the legislature is going to have to appropriate the money as well. It's not just that it's going to come in and we can do it whatever we want with it. So the legislature will clearly be involved. But every dollar that is spent has to be appropriated, whether it's federal money or restricted or whatever. Each department every year gets a budget that's approved by the legislature and signed by the governor. We have a total state budget of about $44 billion. A lot of that's federal aid, maybe $16 billion. The number is restricted for transportation and so forth. We have school aid of about $14 billion. And the general fund around $9 billion, which is kind of the discretionary fund that the legislature has most control over. Our role in the process is really on the revenue side. We, along with the Senate and House Fiscal Agency, estimate how much revenue is going to come into the state every year. We have a revenue estimating conference twice a year where we reach a consensus estimate. And of course, those are the numbers the budget's based on. We have a constitutional requirement for a balanced budget in Michigan, unlike at the federal level. So, we can't spend more than we take in.
Right. So when you and I know that process fairly well, but for those listening, basically the House and the Senate and then the governor's office, basically you represent her, all have to kind of come together and say, and you use a lot of expertise from outside of Michigan, Michigan, who basically look at the auto industry and look at manufacturing and look at Michigan and what we're good at and where our revenues, if you will, come from. And then they try to project into a year out, if not longer than that, of what's the economy going to look like. How that ends up being quite, I really think that's a very smart process for us to do that. When you think about that process, how well have we done at it? I think it's pretty, I'll say a pretty fair process and a very, knowing all of the little pieces that go into that is a very difficult process. But how do you think we do it?
Well, I think we do pretty well, but it is a very difficult process, and I think now it's more difficult than ever. We're in kind of uncharted waters. We've never had such a financial meltdown as we've had recently. We've really never had the auto industry, kind of teetering on the brink as we've had recently. So it's difficult. I mean, it's always hard when the economy turns down to determine, where's the bottom. And I'm not sure we've found the bottom just yet. On the other hand, say back in the 90s where things were good, we were having a hard time estimating all the money that was coming in, and we were underestimating. And I guess it's human nature that when things are really bad, you don't want to be too pessimistic. And I think as a result, you tend to maybe be a little bit too optimistic. So we had to lower our revenue estimates, in January for this fiscal year and next fiscal year, and we lowered our numbers by, I think it was close to $900 million. And we may have, it's possible that when we have our next conference in May, we may have to lower them again because this recession is getting a little bit worse than I think a lot of people thought it was going to.
Yeah.
So, but I think it's a good process. But it just depends on the assumptions that you make, and no one has a crystal ball.
Right.
So we do the best job we can, and I think generally we've done a pretty good job.
Yeah.
But as I say, when turning points in the economy, it's a little difficult.
Well, it's intended to be more of a scientific process. Is really what is a lot of what you're doing when you bring all these folks together.
Well, it is somewhat, but I think it's more of an art.
Okay.
I mean, I think a lot of it is intuition as much. I mean, we do excuse me, we do have economic models that tell us, if auto sales are this amount and interest rates are this, you'll get this much sales tax, this much income tax. But again, you've got to sort of estimate what auto sales are going to be and so forth,
Right.
and interest rates, and we have a pretty good grasp on some of that, but it's difficult. I mean, I think experience is really important. I mean, I've been through a number of these recessions, and I kind of keep telling people that, determine how bad you think things are going to be, and then assume they're going to be worse.
Okay.
Or how good they're going to be, and assume they're going to be better. And that's what we try to do. But sometimes, sometimes you miss it.
Right. And you've been at this for a long, long time. I think what struck me in this year's process was when what we all think of as our big three here in the state of Michigan, when others took over being really the biggest supplier of cars. This kind of year, it seems like this was the year that the numbers tipped, and we did not stay at the top of the list as far as supplying cars. Is that right? Help me understand that again.
Well, yeah. I mean, our domestic companies have been losing market share since the
Right.
mid-'90s. We used to have 75% of the market. Now we have about 45%.
Yeah.
And of course, starting several months ago, auto sales, they dropped off the cliff. If you adjust for population, auto sales now are the lowest they've been since World War II. They're worse than they were, in the early '80s. The numbers are kind of comparable. We have got a lot more people now than we had in the early '80s.
Right.
So, I mean, the auto companies are catching a lot of grief from people nationally and in Congress and so forth. But when you have auto sales this low, I mean, of course, even the foreign automakers are having serious problems too. Toyota's losing money for the first time ever. We know the auto companies have maybe done some things wrong, but basically it's, the other thing, of course, was when oil prices went up so high. And basically what happened is a lot of the domestic makers, their product was obsolete overnight, a lot of their product. But when auto sales are under 10 million units a year, I mean, it's hard for anybody. I don't care how well managed you are.
Right. And that ripples into our economy in
Yes.
ways that.
Oh yes. We're still very dependent on the auto sector in Michigan. Less so than we used to be. And of course, one of our big goals over the next several years, and recently the last few years, is to try to diversify the economy,
Right.
and we need to do that.
And I remember that being talked about when I was first in the House of Representatives, '97 on.
Yeah.
That was a big discussion back then. It was we have to diversify the economy.
Yeah,
So
we've been talking
it
about
takes
that for
time.
actually 30 years.
Well, and it
Yeah.
takes a lot of time, and I know we're doing
Yeah.
other things. We're getting
Yeah.
into aeronautics and defense and some of the other things, but it just takes time. We have some of the best, I believe, best manufacturers and producers of things in the world in Michigan. Now we just got to show that to the rest of the
Right.
world. So.
And we are making a lot of progress. I mean, we've created a lot of jobs in high-tech areas and alternative energy, solar robotics, and the Hemlock Semiconductor up in the Saginaw Valley. But the thing about it is we've lost 300,000 manufacturing, 400,000 manufacturing jobs, mostly in autos, since 2000. So everything we're doing is being swamped by that. I think at some point, hopefully in 2 or 3 years, the auto sector is going to level out, and then we'll start to see some growth from some of these other sectors. But no matter, it's hard to offset those kind of job losses.
It is very hard.
No matter how much you're doing in other areas.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the tax season. It's here. It's on
Right.
us.
Right.
What happens in Treasury during the tax season?